Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for tonight's talk, The Merchant's House Museum, A Tale of Survival with Michael Devonshire. My name is Emily Hillwright, and I'm the Director of Operations at the Merchant's House Museum, New York City's only family home to be preserved intact, both inside and out from the 19th century. Built in 1832, the Merchant's House was home to a wealthy merchant class family and their Irish servants for nearly 100 years, and today is complete with the family's original furnishings and personal possessions, even their clothing. The house offers an intimate and authentic look at domestic life in mid-19th century New York, and it was the very first building in Manhattan designated a city landmark in 1965. During tonight's talk, please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions. We will have a Q&A at the end of the talk. And I am delighted to welcome our speaker tonight, Michael Devonshire. Michael is Director of Conservation at the firm Jan Herd Pokorny Associates, which has overseen all restoration work on the Merchant's House since 1990. His first visit to the Merchant's House was in 1979 as a National Trust intern studying federal and Greek Revival buildings in New York. Michael also serves as a commissioner at the Landmarks Preservation Commission. So welcome, Michael. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Emily.
So I'll turn the floor over to you and enjoy the presentation tonight, everybody.
Thanks so much, Emily. And it really, one of the things that has made an impression on me with this building, not only the fact that it's an incredible gem and of historic significance, is it's almost a miracle that it has survived until today. And I want to go through and just discuss some of the things that are amazing about this building, some of the things that have made an impression on me, and I hope they make an impression upon you too. I'd like to start by quoting Jan Pokorny, my mentor, our boss for many years, and certainly my guiding light in historic preservation. And he was the person who, without a doubt, had the greatest impression upon me with regard to what historic preservation is. And this simple quote by him has made an incredible, an indelible impression upon me. And I will love him and revere him forever. But with regard to the Merchant's House, in the beginning, there was the earth without form and void. And I guess what I want to discover first is, how did we get here? How did we get to this amazing thing that is the Merchant's House Museum? Well, it is, in fact, I like to call it a pile. This pile is a confluence of all different kinds of materials: wood, clay, stone, iron, all of it a confluence extracted, fabricated, and assembled by hand, all of it done by hand. So that confluence of materials gave us this treasure. So where did we start? We started way back then, and everyone, I guess, is familiar with this part of the earth, this phase of the earth's history. And this is where we got the stone. The building is made, as I said, of stone, brick, iron. There are 4 different types of stone on the building: schist, which is in the foundation; limestone, which is in the trim; brown sandstone, which is in the lesser areas of the building used as trim; and slate on the roof. All of that is stone. This material, which is called schist, is what was used for the foundations. Now, you may ask, what is this schist? Well, it's a metamorphic stone that's very plentiful in New York, and you can actually see it if you stroll through Central Park. You'll see outcroppings of schist. It was a readily available building material. The problem is it's kind of ugly, and so although it has great compressive strength, it's not a very handsome stone. And so it was used mostly in foundations where it's not visible. The other stone that we have on the house is limestone. And much of the limestone that we see in New York City on the earlier buildings came from Inwood up in northern Manhattan, or in Tuckahoe a little further north, or in the Sing Sing area. And as you can see, there are veins of limestone also running up and down the Hudson River Valley. And there are also, in Inwood, you can see some escarpments that are made from Inwood marble. A lesser stone, but much more easily crafted, is brown sandstone, which is what we call brownstone. It's a lesser stone in that it's not as handsome as limestone. It can't be polished. And so when you visit the house, you'll see it on the rear windowsills and at the foundation level of the rear facade. Again, there were very easily available veins of brownstone in Newark, in parts of the Hudson River Valley, and in Connecticut. The brownstone that's on the Merchants House Museum came from Portland, Connecticut. Clay. Clay deposits ran up and down the Hudson River Valley and in New Jersey, and they were used to make bricks. You'll see in the lower left, the Romans used brick extensively and faced it with marble. On the lower right, you'll see one of Thomas Jefferson's masterpieces at the University of Virginia. The Three Little Piggies knew that brick was a great material to build with. And in the upper left, you'll see that actually there are brick houses. Again, clay deposits up and down the Hudson River Valley and in the Delaware River Valley. In the Hudson River Valley, by the mid-19th century, there were over 200 brick manufacturing facilities. By the end of the 19th century, there were 300. Again, bricks made traditionally right up until the middle of the 19th century, made by hand, baked by hand, and formed by hand. And then voila, what we have is our brick. Well, what's holding those bricks together is mortar. Again, back to clay. We have burnt limestone, and we have sand that's mixed together to make mortar. All of it mixed by hand. The roof is composed of slate, another metamorphic stone, which is very easily quarried because it breaks away in clefts very easily. Again, all of that fabricated, extracted, and put together by hand. It's a perfect material because you can have a piece of slate that's only a ½ inch or 3/4 of an inch thick, but it has such high surface tension that it sheds water readily. On the interior, interestingly, we have that same clay, sand, mortar mix, and we mix that with horsehair or pig hair, and that makes plaster. We have not only flat plaster on the walls, but we have ornamental plaster, which is made in molds. The plaster work, the decorative plaster work in the Merchants House Museum is really almost beyond belief. It's so incredibly beautiful. Also in the Merchants House, we've got wood. Wood, of course, has to be converted from trees to lumber. All of that is done by hand. Trees were cut by hand, trees were shipped by hand. They were shipped down the Hudson River from the north in rafts. And an interesting point, when we were doing some of the work on the west wall of the Merchants House, we found embossed brands in some of the joist ends. And what that means, what they used to do in order to identify the original owner of the timber, they would emboss a brand in the end of the pieces of wood. They would come down the Hudson, they would get milled on the Upper West Side, and sometimes those brands would stay in the wood. And we found one. I've never seen one anywhere else in New York City. All of this, of course, takes place before the 1860s and the invention of the circular saw, which sped up manufacturing proportionally. All of these tools were the type of tools that were used on the Merchant's House. Much of the sawing was done either in mills or in pits. All of it done traditionally. The house was built by hand. Wood was used not only for heavy timber framing that you see on the right, but also very delicately carved for some of the detailing on the interior of the house. Sometimes you can't tell the difference between the cast plaster and the wood detailing. Windows. Windows are one of my favorite objects. They are essentially pieces of furniture, and they are the one thing, with the exception of the doors, that is exposed to both the interior and the exterior of the house. Typically, windows followed different styles that were established by pattern books that were posted by master builders, and again, put together with mortise and tenon joinery, just like pieces of fine furniture, by hand. The glass in windows was blown by hand in what we call cylinder glass. The earliest glass, of course, was found in Syria from 1500 BC. The mechanisms for working glass did not change for over 500 years. Similarly, the doors are also put together with mortise and tenon joinery, all done by hand. And not to leave out the ironwork, of course, on the house, there is the most pedestrian ironwork in the nails that we've found in the building. And then there are other very important pieces of iron, the decorative iron that you see at the front stoop, at the front facade, and straps, one of which you'll notice in the maid's room. And those straps, if you look in the lower right-hand side, those two straps that come in diagonally from the tops of the walls hold the walls out, because what the roof wants to do is collapse and push those walls out in either direction, and of course, collapse the house. So there we have our building, and it is our gem. Unfortunately, the building has been under attack essentially since the day that it was born. At the front facade, we have faced graffiti for probably the last, well, ever since I've been working on it, people have been tagging the front of the building with graffiti. A relatively new phenomenon in this building anyway, and a relatively benign type of deterioration. You also see some other things going on here on the stoop, and I'll talk about those later. But in addition to that relatively benign graffiti, we have other graffiti that is a little bit, it's a little bit more troublesome. Every time the side of the building gets tagged, it costs between $10,000 and $15,000 to have it removed. Not only is it costly to have to keep going back and removing it, every time it gets removed, there is damage done to the surface of the brick and the surface of the stone. Graffiti removal causes damage. Typically, there's day-to-day warming of the house, As the sun comes up, things get warmer. As the sun goes down, things get cooler. There's expansion. So in the life of this house, the 69,350 days equals 69,350 episodes of expansion and contraction of every piece of material on the house. Every brick expands a little bit, every stone expands a little bit, masonry expands a little bit, and so the house is constantly moving. And this is a constantly moving house that has a weight of 120 pounds per cubic foot. This is a monstrous piece of material expanding and contracting. If you don't think that that's bizarre, it is astonishing to me that more buildings don't fall down in New York. I'm not astonished anymore when I hear that one has collapsed. I'm mostly astonished that older houses are still there. I threw this image of some aged hands in on the right-hand side so that you can maybe get an idea of what someone looks like after about 80 years. Imagine what it is like to be this house. Not only do we have that, the general ins and outs of expansion and contraction, this city, if you are aware at all, is constantly vibrating. There's truck vibration, there's all sorts of noise. The stoop has been subjected to all different kinds of vibration and seismic activity because of construction next door, because of construction across the street. There's a tree in front of the house that wants to lift the stoop out and throw it away. And so one of the things that we've done in order to measure the amount of cracking that's taking place is to install these little instruments called telltales across the cracks of the building so that we can determine if the building is actually in imminent danger of collapse. Again, with age, some materials deteriorate. With vibration, one of the things that we've noticed in our assessments of the building from time to time is that the gutter has subsided so that the water actually drains toward the far end of the gutter rather than to the end where the downspout is. It's just a typical part of the aging of a building in New York City. Now, some of the other environmental phenomenon I found very interesting. You know, nature is constantly acting upon the house. In 120 years, with 46.6 inches of average rain a year, that's 8,854 inches of water, or 738 feet of water dumped on this building over the life of the house. There's 25 inches of snow each year, which over the life of the house equals 3,9,600 feet of snow. That's a lot of weight. Of course, it's not all at once, but one of the problems with that snow and with the water over the life of the house is that because we burned coal up until the mid 20th century or later, that coal produces sulfur, and the sulfur mixes with rain and makes a sulfuric or sulfurous acid, which eats away at the stone, it eats away at the brick. Here you see a piece of our Inwood marble at the front of the house, and you can actually, please don't do this, but you can actually rub your finger across that stone and those small crystalline pieces of aggregate will come off in your hand. It's called disaggregation. It's because the matrix of the stone has been eaten away by sulfuric acid. Similarly, on the roof, where I told you before, the high surface tension causes water to just drip off the slates, acid attack eats away at the surface of the slates, making it more absorbent. Once it's more absorbent, some stones, particularly the brown stones that are on the back, and in some cases the slate, any sort of sedimentary stone, expands with water. And when it expands, it can be highly damaged. Again, the windows, remember, the windows were these wonderful pieces of furniture on the building that are exposed to the interior and the exterior. The problem is they're only protected by 1 or 2 coats of paint. And if that paint is not maintained really just perfectly, water can get into cracks between the glazing compound, cracks between each of the elements of the window, and the wood begins to rot, and you have incredible problems. Iron. Iron, when it gets wet, expands up to 7 times its original volume. And where the iron meets the stone and sinks into the stone, if the iron begins to rust, it will pop that stone with absolutely no mercy. And you see it on the steps at the merchant's house, on all of the steps, up and down the stoop. In the history of the house, of course, there have been over 195 hurricanes. And those hurricanes have affected the integrity of the building. One of the things that is an unfortunate occurrence with regard to the original construction of the house is that a portion of the lower parlor on the west side of the building was constructed on sand. It was actually constructed on soil. And so we had some termite damage. Termites love warm, moist soil. So we had to go in several years ago and replace many of those floor joists. The floors in the house are mostly southern yellow pine, which is a very, very durable wood. Now, in the lower left-hand corner of this image, you'll see an original piece of wood from the house. The lower piece, that's a traditionally grown piece of wood. Above that is a newer piece of southern yellow pine, the way they grow it today on farms. You can see that the lower piece is much denser. It's a wonderful, wonderful material. And it's capable of bearing a considerable amount of foot traffic. And 1 or 2 feet, like say 6 members of the Treadwell family walking through the house from time to time is fine. But when you have many, many feet walking through the building, then you end up with a possible disaster. There are 15,000 visitors to the Merchant's House Museum every year. That's 30,000 shuffling feet. This is an image of Alaric sacking Rome. He had fewer feet sacking Rome than attacked the Merchant's House every year. Imagine, if you will, just 1 grain of sand that comes in off the sidewalk and makes its way around that house, getting pushed around by 30,000 feet. Even more interesting to me is there is, in fact, 2,594,200,000 pounds of tourist meat walking through the building, traipsing through the house, creating live load on all of the floors, shuffling through the house, causing vibration. What that vibration does in some cases is cause cracks in the plaster. You'll see some of the issues that we have. Some of the ceiling cracks actually are caused by the general vibration of just trucks and cars on the streets out front. You see on the bottom in the center, one of the little plaster telltales that I put on one of the walls to see if the plaster cracking was ongoing. We have the same sort of problems that everyone who lives in New York has. In the center at the top, you'll see some plaster damage that was caused by a leak in a sink upstairs. other plaster damage signals water coming in from the exterior of the building. Here, very early on, actually, when we just first started working at the house, this is what the downstairs hall looked like at the lower parlor level. It signaled that there was a lot of water getting into the wall. And before we became the architects for the house, an effort was underway to install waterproofing on the east facade of the house, on the east foundation wall. What happens when water gets into the wall, it soaks the wall, it gets warmed by the interior, and you get attacks by all of those little creatures that love to eat wood. And we found that there were thousands and thousands of termites in the foundation wall, and they were making their way up through the wall because of the water in the wall. So what happened was there was an effort to put a membrane waterproofing on the wall. It was incorrectly specified by the then professionals in charge, so that you'll see a perfect example of what we call galvanic action. We have an aluminum strip that was holding that membrane to the wall, held in place by a ferrous anchor, and the ferrous anchors just rotted away within a couple of years. What that did was cause the membrane to pull away from the wall, and the membrane actually acted as a funnel to carry water back into the wall, exacerbating the termite issues and the damage on the interior of the building. So what do you have to do? You have to redo it. It costs $80,000 to redo that faulty effort. Again, building next door comes down, plaster and stucco are left on the east facade of the merchant's house. You say, well, maybe that's a protective situation. In fact, what that does is conceals the actual condition of the brick at that level. And we have had some leaks at that level. We've had some real damage, and eventually, hopefully, we'll be able to get that stucco off of the wall so that we can see what's going on. Again, everything wants to reach its lowest level, from pressure, soil pressure, water pressure, pressure from the tree on the front. You'll see on the right-hand side, pressure from the tree and the sidewalk is pushing the areaway wall in. We had the same issue on the rear wall. Pressure and vibration. Some areas you just can't see on the house unless you climb around on the building. This is the base of one of the dormers on the front of the house, where you can see there is a zinc coating on the material, on the metal material, the flashing, which is wearing away, and that material is rusting now. You can also see some incipient cracking of wood where lack of paint has resulted in moisture getting sucked up into the wood, causing rot. Again, because of all of these different situations, what we've had to do is establish a schedule for inspecting the building. One of the things that we do is every year, Pye Gardner says, well, let's get to it. In 1991, we created a document that's called an historic structure report. That report talks about the history of the building, but it also includes a list of existing conditions that need to be addressed in order to have the house perform the way it needs to perform. At that point, we had over $1.5 million worth of work that needed to eventually be done. Frequently, we will do an HSR, a historic structure report, for a client, and they say, thank you, and they put it on the shelf. Pye Gardner said, okay, what do we do first? And so the first thing we did was go back and establish some scopes of work to get work done. Here you'll see on the left some sealant in coping stones on the west party wall, and we'll get to that a little later. That poor sealant was allowing water to get into the wall. On the right-hand side, you see the gutter that I talked to you about before, filled with water. Well, in the wintertime, that water freezes too. It's a very bad condition. It's not something that's typically seen unless you get out on the roof and walk around on the thing, which most people don't do in their houses. So one of the results of the problems with the parapet coping on the west party wall was, you'll see in the maid's room, plaster peeling off the wall, paint peeling off the wall. In Pi's office, below, there was paint peeling from the wall. We had to temporarily apply a tarp to keep water from entering the building. Because the building is on the National Register, we are bound by requirements of the LPC, we're bound by requirements of the state, and requirements of the Department of the Interior to have work done at a certain level of quality, unlike that most people have to deal with their buildings. And in addition, here you'll see at least once a year, as I said before, Pi has us do one of the projects that was identified back in the 1990s as being necessary for the repair of the house. One of the interesting things now is that because some of those things were done in the 1990s, windows, for example, you don't just repair a window and leave it for 30 years. We actually have to go back every 3 years, every 4 years, and repaint the windows to make sure that the wood of those windows is protected. Anyway, so here you see some of the interventions that have had to take place over the life of the building. All of those interventions have to be approached with an understanding of the science of building, the chemistry of the building, and the physics of building. Whenever we do work, because the building is an interior landmark, whenever we do work to the finishes on the interior, we have to actually adhere to finishes analysis that was done by a firm, Richbrook Conservation, who determined what all of every phase of color was on the building, going all the way back to the beginning. Then, while we're taking care of the house and doing everything that we can, this thing on the east side of the house happened. The city decided to build a ventilation shaft to the water supply lines in New York City. And the vibration was incredible. It caused enormous amount of plaster damage on the interior of the building, separation of plaster from the brick substrate on the party walls. You'll see in the smaller image here a beam that our structural engineer said that we had to use to attach the plaster back to the wall and stabilize it. Because of that enormous amount of vibration and the enormous amount of damage, there was over $90,000 worth of damage done to the house. They had to close the house down for a while to repair the walls. We decided that we had better have a plaster conditions assessment done. And working with a firm in Pennsylvania, David Flaherty, who did a lot of the ornamental plaster repair, we went through the house and sounded every square foot of plaster and determined where it might be weak, where it might be threatened by additional vibration. And now we have a very good handle on the kind of issues that we can face in the future with the plaster damage. Now, you will see in the larger image, the east side of the house where the new garden is, the new park and garden are being established. A wonderful thing for the house, except that the grade from that garden drains toward the lower part of the photograph on the right, which is right into the back of the garden at the merchant's house. And so any runoff from that park is going to run right into the garden of the merchant's house, possibly damaging some of the growth that we have. I think you'll note that the merchant's house, of course, was once part of a row. It's now standing alone. Once it was protected by buildings on either side, the same size, from wind load. Now it's subject to enormous amounts of wind load, 365 days out of the year. Now, in spite of the enormous efforts that we've been spent in maintaining, not only effort, but money in maintaining the house and anticipating different modes of deterioration, possible catastrophic effects and threats continue in the form of construction at this point of an adjacent building, which poses a significant threat to the merchant's house. You've seen that we did a conditions assessment of the plaster. The plaster on the interior of the building is relatively fragile. In order to protect the plaster, if a building is constructed next door, the house will have to close down for years. And all of the walls, all of the ceilings will have to be supplementally supported by bracing. The construction of the building next door, I think, as Emily will probably mention, is a possible catastrophe to this gem of a building in New York City. And I will leave you with one of the most telling quotes that I've ever seen having to do with our great buildings. Great architecture has only two natural enemies, water and stupid men. Thanks for your patience. I'll take any questions that you have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael. It's always wonderful to hear you talk about the house. You know it in a way that so few people do.
I love the house.
Somebody wants to know, let's see, some questions. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A down at the bottom. Somebody asked, if you were given a totally financed green light, what is the very first thing that you would want to address or repair at the house?
Who asked that question? Was that Pie Gardner?
It was not, but
if I had my way, the first thing I would approach right now would be the stoop and the front door surround, because the stoop is as you saw, a lot of the stone is displaced. The corrosion of the iron entering the steps has caused damage to each of the steps. And this is really the first thing you see when you come to the building. That said, that would be a wonderful cosmetic thing. The other thing that we brought up in the HSR was the possibility of treating the limestone in the Gibbsian surround there with chemicals that would consolidate the limestone so that we don't have that disaggregation, so it doesn't become more of a problem. Eventually that stone will just dissolve, and it's critical that it gets restored. The other thing for me at this point, because that the coping stones at the west parapet wall still leak, I would like to see that get addressed so that we can move in repair the finishes in the maid's room upstairs, and have that be an interpretable room again. The other thing, if there was one more thing that I could do, it would be get the stucco off that east wall and have that entire east wall, have the bricks repointed so that we know what our situation is there. We always can view the situation. And the fourth thing that I would do was make sure that the roof is good. If you don't keep the water out of the roof, then you're in big trouble. But also, if I wish that I could start an endowment so that the windows could be paid attention to. That image that I showed of one of the windows is an extant window, and as you'll recall, we just had these things repainted 5 years ago. Windows are like Chippendale furniture stuck on the side of a house. If you don't protect that wood, it rots and the windows fall apart.
It's something that I think many people have an understanding that old houses require lots of upkeep, but the idea that you've been involved long enough now that we have to go back and redo things that you've already worked on just because that's the nature of the beast.
Absolutely.
Somebody asks, can the city be forced to correct the drainage issues that you mentioned that would negatively impact the garden?
Well, we haven't seen anything dramatic yet. I'm sort of in a wait and see attitude about because the park is so new. It could be, that image that I took was one where I looked over there and I just thought, oh my God, here's a situation where we're going to have water coming into that entry, that entry in the wall back there. I haven't seen anything dramatic yet. But if we had a superstorm Sandy, there would be flooding in the rear yard of the merchant's house, guaranteed. Sure, the city could do something about it. I'm not sure what the possibility is of anything being done in the near future. It takes a long time to have projects get underway with the city.
Somebody asks, are there situations that you feel are truly unique to the merchant's house, or are these structural or conditional challenges that you find typical of most other buildings of this type and age?
They're relatively typical of row houses, but this is a unique situation because the house is standing alone, because it doesn't have the two reinforcing bodies on either side of it. The house moves side to side. Okay, party wall to party wall, unlike most row houses in New York. And because of that, one of the first things that happened back just after my internship, actually, Robert Silman Associates put tie rods connecting the two party walls to make sure that the house, during possibly a dramatic wind load period, wouldn't blow itself apart. So that is a unique situation to this house. The other thing that is kind of unique to this house, when the merchant's house was being built, the way houses were constructed is the party walls, the two opposite party walls would go up a story. They would lay the floor joists across, and then they would go up again another story and lay the floor joists across. The front and rear walls were constructed afterward. And on the merchant's house, we found that there was no physical connection between the front wall and the side party wall, except for an iron strap at the first floor level, an iron strap at the third floor level, and an iron strap at the top, which you can see in the maid's room because the plaster has fallen off the wall. They were the only ones. And so what we had to do was come in, pull bricks out of the front wall, drive stainless steel anchors into the wall to hold the front and side walls in place because there was so much movement, and then replace those bricks again. I mean, that later houses were constructed so that there is a constant physical connection between the party wall and the facade walls.
That speaks to the next question we've got here. Somebody asks about, would any house ultimately face these same challenges when they approach a comparable age? Or have some of these maintenance issues been addressed by new technologies or techniques in building?
It's typical. Each material has essentially a performance life of its own, and you have to monitor buildings, you have to monitor materials, you have to keep your eye on these things all the time. And the best way to prevent deterioration is to attack it, to intervene when it's incipient, not unfortunately later. And in some cases, people don't see the deterioration until later. And then the cost becomes enormous. And then, I mean, we know what people do. They'll either do a half-baked effort on a building, or they'll say, well, this building is too far gone. We have to demolish it.
I guess one last question here. Somebody said that I heard the house is not built on bedrock, but instead on fill. Is this true?
It's built on bedrock.
All right, that answers that question. An easy one to end the night here. I think that that's all the time that we have for this evening, but thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Thank you, Michael. The Merchants House is currently open to visitors on Thursdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, with options for both guided and self-guided tours. Starting next month, we are excited for the return of summer evenings in the garden. On Thursdays in June, July, and August, the Merchants House is open until 8 p.m. with wine in the garden. This summer, we're also offering guided tours and live music on select evenings. You can visit our website at merchantshouse.org for more information. This month, unfortunately, as we have discussed, marks the 10-year anniversary of our battle to protect the Merchants House from the development next door, development that is guaranteed to cause irreversible structural damage to our landmark building. Over the last decade, the museum has spent over $750,000 on attorneys and engineers, funds that should have gone to conservation projects, to restoration, and to educational projects. Tonight's talk, I hope, gave you a greater appreciation for the work that goes into a house like the Merchants House and just exactly what is at stake. If you are able, please consider making a donation or becoming a member of the Merchants House. With all that we are facing, it is the support of friends like you that keeps us pushing forward. You can visit merchantshouse.org/support. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight. Thank you, Michael, for being here.
Thank you.
And have a great night, everybody.